Well, we're standing in the chapel of St. John, which the brothers occupied from 1706 till 1771. It became the centre of the Institute. It was de La Salle's choice to come to Rouen because of the difficulties he'd encountered first in Reims and then subsequently in Paris. The chapel floor, actually, which I'm standing, is a false ceiling put in from below, but the shape of the chapel is pretty much as you can see it here today. We're looking towards the sanctuary, where de La Salle would have said Mass many times for the brothers, for the boarders, for all the people who came here to Mass. There would have been on one side, probably, we don't know which side each was, but an illustration, a painting of Saint Sever, because he was the patron saint of this particular parish, and also a painting of St. John, a martyr after whom the chapel is named. The people in the chapel, you might have expected in de La Salle's time, were the brothers, because the novices came here, and the novices were here under Brother Barthélemy, who subsequently would be de La Salle's first successor. But at the request of the merchants of Rouen, de La Salle opened up also a boarding school. The boarding school concentrated on teaching commercial methods rather than the more classical education that could have been afforded by the colleges of the other congregations, such as the Jesuits. The boarders were looked after here and spent the time here during the week and sometimes for longer periods of time, and they formed a very important group because the curriculum of the boarders is the first major change towards what became, or a century and a half later, secondary modern education. That is commercial methods, scientific methods, and the study of foreign languages. As you look at the chapel, there are actually two entrances. There's the entrance that the brothers had, and the entrance also that the boarders had. But there was another entrance which was reserved for two other groups in this particular part of St. John. Not long after de La Salle began the work, he was asked if he would take in charge a group of young adolescents who had had difficulties with society, possibly spoiled children of some family who committed some kind of fault. And they were brought in and they were housed separately, treated separately, but always with the encouragement that if they behaved and conformed to the rules of the establishment, they could follow courses along with the boarders, and indeed, perhaps eventually join the boarding school. But after 1709, 3 years after taking over the property, de La Salle was asked to take also what were called prisoners by force. That is to say, those people who were put away by the infamous lettre de cachet of Louis XIV. These would have been noblemen, priests, anybody really who committed some kind of fault but who would not be put into the ordinary prisons. And they were detained here indefinitely. We'll have a chance to see where they were detained subsequently during our visit. The work was to try and help them to accept their banishment, if you like, and also to improve and possibly then be released. This was a very demanding work, not always successful. In the history of St. John, we have examples of inspections being made by the Archbishop, who'd invited de La Salle first of all, Archbishop Colbert, of course, of the Reims family, would have known de La Salle quite well, and also by the head of the Parlement of Normandy, Monsieur Poincaré. And it was these two who invited de La Salle to take these prisoners by force. In his last years, after the return from the south and the chapter that put Brother Barthélemy in charge, we know de La Salle spent a great deal of his time working with the novices, but also a great deal of time working with the prisoners by force. These poor individuals put away indefinitely, trying to improve them, trying to get them to accept their lot. And according to his biographer Blain, he was very, very successful. I've just come down the steps into the dungeons of St. John. Yes, dungeons. Because remember that after 1709, de La Salle was asked to take and look after people who were put away by the infamous lettre de cachet. That's to say, people who were indefinitely detained. These people came from different ranks in society, but usually from the upper levels of society. They included noble people, we know, we know they included also some priests. They were detained indefinitely. I think when we think about what that meant, you can see that they would not have enjoyed this imprisonment very much. This was the downstairs part. They did have a certain part outside, completely fenced in, where they were allowed to take recreation, as was custom in prisons. Some of them, of course, were dangerous and had to be restrained by force. And we'll see in another moment one of the dungeons where this happened to people. What did the brothers do with them? They were completely untrained to look after people like this. I mean, who would have been trained at this period of history in 1709 to look after people who didn't want to be locked up and who had no recourse to get out? The brothers tried to teach them in the sense of offering them mathematics, astronomy, all sorts of things actually, which are quite off the usual thing. And I suppose also they did quite a lot of religious instruction with them. The difficulty, as is shown in the history of St. John, is that again and again these people revolted against their imprisonment. We know that there were many inquiries held. The very first one held round about a year after the first people were detained here, and the Archbishop himself and Monsieur Poincaré both came to find out what the difficulties were. According to the official account in St. John, the difficulties were not with the prisoners, but with the brothers, who were very poorly fed because nobody was paying for them. These people were put away, but there was no extra provision of money made to buy provisions and things like this. Later, we're going to find in the history of St. John that some of these people had their own money, and in that sense could buy things and have things sent in from the outside. This maison de force, or dungeon as we call it, was an important part in de La Salle's life because the local parish priest at Saint-Sever was very jealous of his rights as a parish priest, and he insisted that everybody here come to the ceremonies on Sunday and on important feasts. De La Salle, of course, could not allow this. Indeed, the authorities who'd put these people here would not allow it. But his pettiness of mind and his determination to win his way was such that in the very, very weeks that de La Salle lay dying, the parish priest took a complaint, and de La Salle was momentarily suspended from being able to say Mass because of this particular situation. I'm standing in one of the cells which also formed part of this below ground part of the dungeons of St. John. It may surprise you to think that there were actually cells. But as I stand here in a little area about 2 meters by 2 meters, I can see where the doors have been taken off, but where the iron bars that once contained the door still remain. And we know that in some of the cells there would have been chains. And it appears that this became necessary after people were allowed to buy their own things and bring things in. Undoubtedly, people at times would bring in something and perhaps get drunk and become violent. And so these cells were used for restraint. This wasn't the usual place where people lived. They didn't live here, they were restrained here. But the whole area of this downstairs, this whole dungeon area, was assigned in various ways. The fact that there were actually 5 or 6 of these cells seems to indicate that they became necessary in the history of St. John. In the various investigations that go in the history of St. John, we hear about complaints, we hear about people coming and taking information and so on like that. But in general, the support given by the authorities to the brothers' work here at St. John was very important. Later, we're going to find that this was a precedent in the history of the Institute. We're going to find, for example, in the 1830s in Paris till 1848, the brothers undertook work in all the prisons of Paris, a continuation of the work launched here first at St. John.